We've been told that hormones cause mood swings, that women are emotional, unpredictable, or too sensitive.
Women oftentimes get a hard time about the idea that they're hormonal during their period, and that's literally when hormones are the lowest.
Dr. Sarah Hill reveals how stress, sleep, and inflammation quietly rewire the female brain, changing focus, energy, and even fertility. And the most surprising part?
A lot of women think that they're having regular cycles and as a result are regularly ovulating, and they're not. One of the biggest predictors of failure to ovulate is stress.
This conversation uncovers the real science of your cycle, how progesterone protects your calm, why stress steals it, and what it takes to build true hormonal resilience.
Progesterone can have this really calming effect. The first thing that happens in perimenopause is that levels of progesterone are really low. Their body is not as sort of resilient to hormonal changes, and the result is that they feel worse during perimenopause than they would need to.
Dr. Sarah Hill, it is amazing to have you back on the show. I've been looking forward to this. Welcome back.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here with you.
I'm so excited. So last time you came on, we were talking all about the pill, about birth control and how it affects women. And this time we're going to be talking about the period brain, which I'm very excited about because I've got lots and lots of questions for you. Why don't we kick off with what made you write the period brain? What made you look into that?
Well, I've always been really interested in the sort of hidden effects of hormones on creating the experience of being and feeling and experiencing the world the way that we do as women. And so, in some ways, it was a very similar process to when I wrote This Is Your Brain on Birth Control, where with the pill, I was just really interested in, given that women's hormones shape the way that they are and think and feel and everything else, how does then taking synthetic hormones that prevent us from producing our own sex hormones, how does that change us? And this was sort of a similar type of a question, but I was really interested in trying to understand. It started off with just a question about PMS, right? And just this idea that so many women feel really terrible for about 2 weeks out of the cycle. And I was just trying to, I approached the question as like a scientific curiosity. Why is it that we have inherited this tendency to feel awful? Like I didn't believe that was made a whole lot of sense. My background is in biology, and so I tend to approach things in terms of function. And like when we look at estrogen in the first half of the cycle, there's a lot of sort of things that make a lot of functional sense there. Like you get an increase in sexual desire and you smell sexier to men and you look sexier to men. And, there's all of these like beautiful effects that really make sense when we consider that estrogen is high across the cycle at points when sex can lead to conception. So it all makes a lot of sense. And then when you look at progesterone, there's just, one, nobody's talking about it, right? Like we don't really, you hear a lot about estrogen and it's like estrogen does this and estrogen does that, but there's really not a whole lot out there in the world about what progesterone is doing. And the only thing that we really know about it is that it tends to be high in the cycle at times that women feel terrible, right? When they have PMS. And so I just wanted to get a better handle on like, what is progesterone actually doing? Right. So like, what is it doing in terms of shaping our brains and in our bodies? Like, how is it changing us? And then why does that have the effect of making so many women feel awful? And so it's really just, again, it's trying to get at the question of how do our hormones influence who we are? And then how can we use that information to better understand ourselves?
And to kind of adapt our lifestyle. So when we look at, I'm going to dive into progesterone with you and also PMS, PMDD. But when we look at, first of all, as a kind of overview of the menstrual cycle, just so women, maybe who haven't been to biology class recently, just kind of understand. Do you want to give us a really quick kind of 2-minute overview of what's happening?
Absolutely. So, if we'll just assume for the sake of simplicity, a 28-day cycle, right? And so most women have somewhere around that. So we'll just assume a 28-day cycle. And the first day of your cycle is the day that you get your period. So that's why your doctor is always asking you what was the first day of your last menstrual cycle, is because they're trying to figure out what the first day is. And on that day that bleeding begins, our hormone levels are really low. So women's levels of estrogen and progesterone are actually lowest that they'll ever be across the cycle, which is really funny because women oftentimes get a hard time, or they're given a hard time about the idea that they're hormonal during their period. And that's like literally when hormones are the lowest. And so like your hormones are at their absolute lowest on the day you get your period. And having that really low level of sex hormone, it sends a signal to the brain. Like the brain has receptors for both estrogen and progesterone, which are women's two primary sex hormones. And when those receptors are naked, right, when they're not getting a lot of stimulation from hormone, that tells the brain to tell the ovaries that it's time to start maturing some egg follicles and ultimately lead to ovulation. And so that's what happens. So the brain tells the pituitary, which then tells the ovaries, like, stimulate egg follicles. And so the egg follicles begin to get stimulated, they start to mature, and as this is going on, it causes the release of estrogen. And estrogen rises then during the early parts of the cycle. So women can usually feel a little bit of an uptick in energy levels that tends to coincide with estrogen levels really starting to, kind of get ramped up right around day 5 or 6 of the cycle. And then estrogen levels climb and climb and climb, and then they start to go really high right prior to ovulation. So generally between like around day 9 or 10 is when estrogen levels are getting really high, and then they generally peak around day 14, which is when women ovulate. So during this period right prior to ovulation, we call this the fertile window because this is the period in the cycle when sex can lead to conception. Right. And it corresponds with this time in the cycle when estrogen is at its highest. Right. And during this time, women tend to feel sexier, they look sexier, they smell sexier, they want more sex, they have more sex. So it's all about everything related to sex. And
And your
that's
skin
because,
looks better as well, right, as
oh,
well? You
yeah,
tend to,
no,
like,
you look,
just if I
yeah,
didn't always have the
no.
skin I had at ovulation. Just
Yeah, no, I know.
yeah.
It's like you like there's just kind of something about you. It's like women just look good, they smell good, they earn more money. Like they've done these studies with exotic dancers and they find that they earn more money near high fertility in the cycle because again, their skin looks great and they're feeling sexy and they're moving sexy and people pick up on it, right? And so as a result, they earn more money if they're dancers. And so all of this, estrogen is kind of orienting the brain and the body toward sex. And this is because this is the time in the cycle when sex can lead to conception. And then, so that's around day 14 that the egg gets released. So that's ovulation. And then after ovulation, estrogen levels fall and the empty egg follicle actually becomes a temporary endocrine structure that's called the corpus luteum. And it begins to release women's second primary sex hormone, which is progesterone. And so progesterone increases and then peaks during the 3rd and 4th weeks in the cycle. So ovulation generally happens around day 14. So that's 2 weeks into the cycle, right? And then the second 2 weeks of the cycle are all about progesterone, right? And so that's when progesterone is being released by the corpus luteum. And this is orienting the body and the brain toward everything related to implantation and pregnancy. Right. So rather than women feeling really sexy and alive and like they want to go out and, dance the night away and attract partners, instead they tend to feel more internal. Their sexual desire decreases. They're hungrier. They're sleepier. Their ability to pick up on potential threats in the environment becomes really heightened. Right, which can lead women to feel a little bit more sort of emotionally sensitive because they can pick up on more than they can. Their brain is attuned to those types of things, and so it's really and this goes on for the last 2 weeks of the cycle, and then after right around day 27, 28, if an egg has not implanted, right, and pregnancy did not take hold over that point in the cycle, estrogen or progesterone levels fall. And then the endometrial lining becomes destabilized and you get your period, right? So first 2 weeks of the cycle, estrogen rises and falls. Second 2 weeks of the cycle, progesterone rises and falls. And then, and that's kind of all she wrote.
What's happening? So when we look at that, right, so with the progesterone, you mentioned something quite interesting there around the fact that we can pick up on signals and we tend to be a bit more vigilant because that also is something that when we look at perimenopause, right, when progesterone, but this is different because this is when progesterone is dropping, right? At this point that you're talking about in the luteal phase, progesterone is high, but progesterone also seems to be linked with just anxiety when it drops. Like I remember that was one of the first things I was like, oh my God, where's this anxiety come from? I didn't used to have this.
The thing about progesterone is when it gets broken down by the body, it releases this neurosteroid called allopregnanolone. and it is really calming to the brain. So it actually activates your GABA receptors in your brain. And GABA is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter that the brain uses to create different types of psychological experiences. And so one of the things that GABAergic activity is known for is for this really calming effect on the brain. So just to give some tangible examples of what it feels like to be under the spell of GABA, we have a lot of GABAergic activity after doing like yoga or meditating or like sitting by a fireplace or even drinking alcohol activates your GABA receptors. And so it has that sort of calming effect where you just, you feel really relaxed. And we get this like all natural, source of GABAergic activity from the release of progesterone. And so progesterone can have this really calming effect. And what you're describing in perimenopause is what happens a lot of times to women is the first thing that happens in perimenopause is that they have sort of a deficient corpus luteum and their levels of progesterone are really low. And the effect is that you're lacking this calming neurotransmission that your brain is used to, and that creates anxiety. And so a lot of that perimenopausal anxiety is the result of low levels of progesterone. And when you have low levels of progesterone, that means you also have low levels of allopregnanolone. And this is, something that does provide a potent source of anti-anxiety neurotransmission in the brain. And so lacking that can oftentimes make women feel like the wheels are coming off emotionally. And that type of anxiety also is something that sometimes women will experience within the course of a single menstrual cycle, especially in the late luteal phase. So, if you look at the luteal phase as a 2-week construct, which, we give or take, it's about 2 weeks, right? So the first half of that is progesterone levels rising, and then the second half is progesterone levels falling. And this can actually create very different sensations psychologically, just simply because of what it means to be experiencing your GABA receptors having increasing transmission. That feels calming, right? That's relaxing. But then when you have that being withdrawn because progesterone levels start to fall, then that can feel anxiety provoking. And so for, one of the things that I recommend for women in the book is that, really starting to understand your luteal phase and the way that you experience both progesterone rising and then progesterone falling, and not assuming that it's going to be a singular response, right? And that the way that we feel in the early part of the luteal phase may be different than the way that we feel in the later luteal phase, with one being like sort of more calming and tired, and the other one being a little bit more anxious and overwhelmed, and really starting to get a handle on your own relationship with this very potent but often undiscussed hormone.
Because you start to feel a bit edgy, right? And we see this in teenage girls, and it can be quite difficult for them, for example.
Can also be difficult for their mothers.
For their mums.
Is what I can say as somebody with a teenage daughter.
This is true. And I think and then add a mum who's in perimenopause, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say, and then you add the perimenopause piece in, and it's like it's funny because the teenage years really do overlap with many women's perimenopausal years, and it's like, could there be a worse combination?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think so.
That's when their partners just move out because they're just like, I can't take it.
Yeah, there's like, that's enough. I've had it.
Yeah. I'm done. Exactly. So when we're looking at, then you mentioned like how it's very calming progesterone, and then it can also, as it drops off, we can get that anxiety. So that very late luteal phase, similar to perimenopause. What about PMS and PMDD? Because I know you've done a lot of research and a couple of chapters in the book dedicated to this, around why so many women feel bad at the end of their menstrual cycle, at the end of the month.
One thing that's not really appreciated about the luteal phase is like just how wild and wide the hormonal swings are that we're experiencing at this time. And a lot of this has to do with the way that the menstrual cycle and the hormonal changes across the cycle are generally laid out. And I urge any of you listening right now, Google menstrual cycle hormones, and you're going to get a picture that looks like, it's going to show the 28 days, and then it's going to show this like rise and fall of estrogen during the first half of the cycle. And then it's going to show this rise and fall of progesterone in the second half of the cycle. And then there's also a little tiny, rise and fall of estrogen in the second half of the cycle as well. The thing that you don't know about that figure, and when you look at that figure, it's going to show the peaks of estrogen and the peaks of progesterone as being roughly the same size. But what you don't understand, and what most people aren't told, is that the way that they have these scaled is actually not drawn to scale, and that levels of progesterone are actually 10 times higher, and they peak at 10 times higher than peak levels of estrogen. And so if you actually had that picture drawn to scale, what you would see was this little tiny blip of this increase in rise and fall of estrogen in the first half of the cycle. And then in the second half, you have this big mountain that you're rising and falling of progesterone in the second half of the cycle. And then again, this little blip of estrogen changing in that time too. And most people don't realize that, like that the changes that we're experiencing hormonally in the second half of the cycle are, a magnitude higher than the changes that we experience in the first half of the cycle. And this takes a lot of flexibility, a lot of cellular plasticity to be able to adapt to. Because anytime that you have cells in your body, including the cells in your brain, that are sensitive to hormonal changes, they have to adjust to the changing levels of hormone, right? And so if there's a lot of hormone, they have to like down regulate their receptors so that way they don't get totally inundated by signal. And if there's not a lot of the signal, right, they have to sprout out new connections. So that way they're able to mop up as much of the signal as there is. And being able to have the cellular plasticity that's reaching out and grabbing hormone, right, and then retreating so it doesn't get totally flooded by hormone, that requires a lot of cellular plasticity. And that's something that, unfortunately, our contemporary environment is really good at eroding. Right. So a lot of us are lacking what I call resilience to hormonal changes, just simply because, the Western diet, our sedentary lifestyles, the fact that many women don't feel like they have sort of control over their lives, like they feel chronic stress. They don't, they're not able to invest in the relationships and the social support in their lives that they want to. All of these things have the effect of increasing inflammation and lowering our resilience to hormonal changes in ways that minimize our cell's ability to do this sort of like, grabbing onto hormone and then withdrawing. And we're not able to do that as quickly. And the result is that we can feel really terrible. And so one of the takeaways from the book is just that there's a lot that we can do to minimize the turbulence that we experience when we're going through periods of large hormonal change. And this is definitely something that we see with women who experience PMS, right? Is that because of a lack of cellular plasticity, they're not able to sort of ride the wave of the hormonal changes, and then they feel terrible. But we also see this with perimenopause, right? Where women are having a really terrible time because their body is not as sort of resilient to hormonal changes. And the result is that they feel worse during perimenopause than they would need to if they were taking some simple steps to try to bring back some of that resilience. And we know that it's a similar set of mechanisms, because generally when you look at the research, it seems to show that women who are at a greater risk of experiencing PMS and PMDD, so women who have really bad experiences as they're transitioning through the luteal phase, they're also the ones who are most at risk for developing postpartum depression. They're also the ones who are most at risk for developing mental health related issues during perimenopause. And so it seems that, having sensitivity, like heightened oversensitivity to hormonal changes, is something that puts women at risk during these inflection points, right, when hormones are changing very rapidly. But the good news is that there are things that we can do to try to increase our resilience to hormonal changes, and then make that, less like falling off driving off the side of a cliff, and instead make it more like riding a smooth wave as we transition through these different phases, both of our cycle and of our lives.
Really interesting. So when we're looking at like that cellular resiliency, what you're saying, or correct me if I'm wrong here, it sounds like some of these symptoms are being, or this lack of resiliency is being driven by more inflammation in the body. If we were not as inflamed, we would have better resilience.
Absolutely, because one of the things that inhibits cellular plasticity is inflammation. And inflammation, I mean, it's kind of it's kind of the redheaded stepchild of of things that goes on in the body. Everybody wants to beat up on inflammation, and inflammation is great when it's contained and happens in short bursts. Like, if you get a cut on your arm, like, thank goodness for inflammation, because that's part of the process where your immune system is going in and taking care of business and killing any pathogens and allowing your wounds to heal. But when inflammation is experienced chronically, like a lot of us experience when we're experiencing, constant unrelenting stress, and we're not getting enough sleep, and we're not eating the foods that nourish our bodies, and we're not moving our bodies in ways that are anti-inflammatory, all of these things have the effect of eroding our cells' ability to quickly adapt to things. And it's because inflammation is one of these things in the body that it sort of sends an all hands on deck signal to all the energy in the body, right? It's like, all right, we have an emergency here, folks, because generally, and historically, inflammation is something that we get during times when we're likely to be, physically threatened or experiencing some sort of physical harm. And so when we get inflammation in the body, that's telling the body, stop the other things that you're doing and start investing in immune function. Because right now we might have a problem on our hands. And obviously, because, survival is super important, our body listens to that, right? And it's like, okay, all right, we'll stop what we're doing over here, and we'll, allow the body to direct all of its energetic resources toward fueling this inflammatory response. But then what ends up happening is that the processes that are necessary for things like cellular plasticity, that all goes on the wayside, right? All of that gets sort of, given second because that's a first world problem as far as the body's concerned, if it's thinking that it's having to deal with, the possibility of injury. And so we have all of this inflammation comes at the expense of our body investing in all of the other things that bodies like to do, in order to thrive and stay alive. Right. And so if we do things and take steps to minimize inflammation, especially, like I said, chronic inflammation in the body, by minimizing stress and doing the things that sort of promote the pillars of health, which are eating, whole foods that nourish the body, making sure that you're managing stress, making sure that you're getting enough sleep, getting exercise, having a social network so you feel social support. When you do these things, you're taking steps toward investing in a body that is resilient to hormonal changes. And those things really can make a huge difference. And it's like, it sounds almost, like boring, like, oh, okay, news alert. Taking care of your health is going to make you feel better. Like, this isn't, going to make the cover of the New York Times, because in some ways it's so obvious. Which is why one of the things that I do in the book is I really try to break down like some simple steps you can take to actually do these things, because, it's like, we know that most people know, right, that being in good health is going to support their mental health and is going to support their ability to feel their best when they're going through periods of hormonal change, whether it's through perimenopause or through PMS. But what's oftentimes the difficult part is like understanding how to fit all of those things into your day, because everybody's busy. It's like, we're all so busy and we've got a million things calling for our attention. And so what are some small steps that we can take to actually start to change our lives in ways that are going to help promote resilience to hormonal changes without feeling like our lives are totally upside down? Because most people don't have time for that, and if you're like, okay, well, here's what you need to do. You need to get some exercise, you need to eat more whole foods, and you need to get some sunlight, because that'll help set your circadian rhythms, and you need to have a network. I mean, it's like, where do you start? That feels like totally overwhelming. And so in the book, I talk about, some of the things that I did just to start my own, sort of health journey, because like everybody in the world, I've not always done everything right, but I've gotten to a place in my life, thankfully, where, I do have a lot of practices that are very health promoting, and I did them one step at a time, where it's like putting one foot in front of the other, just to sort of build up to a state of hormonal resilience.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I think we're just hearing this everywhere, this idea of resiliency, right? For longevity, for hormonal health, for so many things. And people can sort of dive into the book to see the practices. I guess I think a lot of women listening to this will be also, like we mentioned, thinking about their daughters, because when you think about the massive amount of stress that you go through in your teenage years, in terms of constant exams every single year, and then you get examined again and again, and then you go to university and maybe you do a postgrad, and there's all these things going on, and meantime you're then being exposed to more toxins, you're being invited to drink alcohol with friends, and all this stuff that's going on. Would you say then that mastering stress as a whole is going to be key to you feeling good across the menstrual cycle?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, when we look at, and it's not only about feeling good across the cycle, but it's also supporting the cycle. Because one thing that I think that people have minimized, and I think that this is intentional in some ways, because everybody in the world benefits from us being overscheduled. It's like so many things would cease to exist if people weren't completely overscheduled, and we are. And it is bad for our hormones, and it's bad for our resilience to hormonal changes. The fact is, the female body will not ovulate if we aren't managing our stress right. And one of the biggest predictors of failure to ovulate is stress. And even though, like, we kind of know this on some level, like, this probably won't sound like a news flash to many people, I don't know that people actually realize how common it is, because failure to ovulate will happen oftentimes without even getting a blip in the radar with respect to your cycle. So a lot of women think that they're having regular cycles and as a result are regularly ovulating, and they're not. And just to give an example from my own research, we study women's hormonal changes across the cycle and the way that they're related to different types of psychological and behavioral changes. And as a result of, we have women coming in the lab and we measure their hormones, and we're tracking ovulation to try to figure out where they are in the cycle. And every year, and we only recruit women who are healthy, ages like 18 to 29. So these are like relatively young, healthy women with regular menstrual cycles. And without fail, every single time we run one of these studies, in about 30% of the sample, we get failure to ovulate, where they're just not ovulating. And it might just be that cycle, right? It might happen a couple cycles in a row. And generally, then they'll go on and ovulate. Right? But there's a lot of
Will they get a
sporadic.
period? So will they
Yeah.
assume they are
Yeah.
ovulating?
Yeah.
Okay.
They think that they're, and their period usually comes on time. And so they don't know. They have no idea that they're not ovulating. And this is very common. And, in our like healthy college sample, we get about 30%. And I talk to my colleagues who study the same thing I do, and they get the same rates. So they get about 30% as well. And this just goes to show like that, stress, we tend to minimize it because it's like we feel like we can do everything. And I think that one of the reasons that we feel like we can do everything is because everybody expects us to do everything. And so we think this must be normal, right? It must be normal that I can only sleep for 6 hours if I'm able to actually get everything done. But it's not. It erodes at our health. It erodes at our ability to ovulate. And when we're not ovulating, we're not producing sex hormones. I mean, that's like the primary way that women produce sex hormone in their body. And what tends to happen, and the one that tends to get the shortest shrift in the failure to ovulate camp is progesterone, because you'll get estrogen a lot of times with these cycles. Egg follicles will start to get stimulated, which releases estrogen. But then none of them are getting stimulated sufficiently, because the body is like, screw this, like this, there's too much stress here. We are not ovulating. Then it will never fully mature one of those eggs. So you're getting estrogen release, but then nothing actually gets released at ovulation. And so you never produce progesterone. And so you end up with a lot of these cycles that tend to be kind of an estrogen dominant, estrogen only cycle. And that it tends to make women feel unbalanced. I mean, and then you don't get all of the really great health benefits of progesterone or the mental health benefits of progesterone. And so you can also erode, not only eroding at your body's ability to ride the waves of hormonal change, but you also erode at your body's ability to produce hormone, because when the body does not feel safe, supported, and fed, like that it has enough energy, the body will oftentimes cut ovulation off at the pass, because our body has absolutely no interest in investing in a pregnancy that it doesn't have the resources to complete. And so one of the ways that our bodies will sort of cut that off at the pass is by stopping ovulation in its tracks.
When you see that, I'm curious, that you and the other scientists are seeing 30%, right, of the time women are not ovulating. Do you think that's a modern thing? If we go back 50 years ago, do you think women were not ovulating a third of the time, or?
Right. I definitely think that it's probably gotten worse. Like I think you're always going to get failure to ovulate from different types of environmental stressors, because other contexts that precede failure to ovulate are things like so. For example, if you get a cold or the flu, sometimes you'll skip a cycle, and you won't even know it. Sometimes you don't know it, or if you don't have enough to eat, like if your calorie intake is lower than your output, that oftentimes will also precede failure to ovulate. And so, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, we may have seen some failure to ovulate from not getting enough calories, right? Or maybe more failure to ovulate from infectious disease, since, that's something that we've gotten a pretty good handle on currently. But certainly we have a higher rate now, I think, than we probably did in the past. I mean, because I think that all that is much outweighed by just how much stress so many of us are under, right? And stress in terms of, psychosocial stress. So not having a community, not having enough time with our community, and sort of feeling, safe and loved, but then also being completely overscheduled, and the list goes on.
I mean, this is really fascinating. So I think, because the other thing you see is that I think when I was looking like many years ago now, because my eldest is 18, but looking at fertility, I think it was reported you had like a 1 in 3 chance of falling pregnant any month, right? But actually now we're seeing fertility rates decline, and so you wonder whether actually that 1 in 3 may now be declining, because if you're not even ovulating every single month, right, you've not got a chance that month.
Right, and infertility is a real issue right now. I mean, I think that we see so many women and their partners that are struggling to have babies now, and I have no doubt in my mind that one of the pieces to that is just the chronic stress. I mean, it's like living right now is not easy, and people are feeling it, and our body, the female body is like this incredibly amazing repository of inherited wisdom from our ancestors, and part of that wisdom is shutting down ovulation when it doesn't seem like a good time to have a baby. And so, I think that the good news is, like even when the world has gone crazy, right, and seems very stressful, there are things that you can do to minimize your perceived stress and create the type of psychological landscape that's going to help to promote ovulation. And that includes, there's different types of practices that you can do just in terms of minimizing stress, using different types of stress reducing meditations. There's been a lot of really great research on therapeutic writing, and it's just simply writing to minimize your stress. And I have a lot of evidence that I talk about in the book for these types of practices, just in terms of minimizing stress levels
Is
and
that like
increasing.
journaling, therapeutic
Yeah,
writing?
yeah, but it's a specific type of journaling that's aimed at minimizing stress, and it's been found to be really effective in terms of allowing people to have a better feeling of control over their stress, and to be stress reducing. That and different types of meditation, exercise. Of course, there's a ton of research on that, both in terms of its antidepressant effects, which are great for anybody going through any period of hormonal transition, whether it's the luteal phase or the perimenopausal transition. I mean, exercise is an absolute game changer. But there's these other different smaller practices that we can take to try to minimize stress, or at least minimize our perceptions of stress in ways that will help to support and promote fertility and ovulation.
Ever notice your sleep is off, your energy dips without warning, or your mood feels more reactive than usual? You're doing all the right things, eating well, exercising, taking your supplements, but something still feels out of sync. The culprit might be something you can't see: EMF exposure. Wi Fi, 5G, Bluetooth, they're around us constantly, and emerging research suggests EMFs may influence melatonin production, sleep cycles, and metabolic health, especially with the continuous exposure throughout the day and night. That's why I've become much more intentional about reducing EMFs, particularly in the evenings and when I'm working long hours on my laptop. And that's why I've partnered with Defender Shield, because their products are the ones I personally use and trust. When I need headphones at my desk, I use their air tube headphones. They deliver sound through a hollow air tube, which means there's no EMF radiation near my head, just clean audio without the exposure. If I have my laptop on my lap, I always use the Defender Pad. It helps block up to 90 gigahertz, including the full 5G spectrum, shielding both radiation and heat from reaching my body. And in the evenings, I wear their blue light blocking glasses to help support melatonin levels and more stable blood sugar, both key for quality sleep and hormone balance. And when I travel, their EMF blocking sleep mask is a must. It shields the eye area, one of the most sensitive neural pathways, from ambient EMFs in places like hotel rooms and airplanes. Defender Shield was founded by Daniel DeBorn, a former telecom engineer with over 40 years at AT&T and Bell Labs. His deep expertise in EMF safety is built into every product. If you want to reduce your EMF load, support better sleep, and create a healthier environment for your hormones and recovery, this is a great place to start. Head to defendershield.com/Angela and use the code Angela to save 10%. That's defendershield.com/Angela and use code Angela at checkout to get 10% off.
I mean, one thing interesting, Sarah, actually, that was a question from my community, is mums who have daughters who are kind of actually a little bit like they're sort of exiting the teenage years. They're like 18, 19, 20, 21. A lot of them seem to have very long cycles of 60 to 80 days. So what you're talking about here is people who are having a regular cycle. So they would actually think probably they had ovulated, but then actually what you're seeing is they haven't. Some people obviously are getting these longer cycles, so we know they haven't ovulated because they would have a bleed. Why might that be happening, and why would you still bleed if you hadn't ovulated? Can you sort of explain so people can really start to understand what's going on for themselves?
That's a really interesting question. So just first a question to you. So these people, these young women who are having these really long cycles, are they eventually ovulating? Is it like one skipped cycle and then one regular good, like, quote unquote,
Do you know,
good
I don't know
cycle?
because it was kind of submitted as a couple of people put it forward as a question like, why
Yeah.
is it that we see this? I think from my understanding, just briefly, is that yes, they are then having a cycle, but actually what's happening is their doctors are prescribing birth control. That seems to be
Right.
the
Yeah.
solution. Which
That's the
you can go
solution.
back and listen to my last episode with Sarah to find out why that
Yeah.
isn't such a good
Yeah.
idea.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. That's a solution for everything, right? It's like, oh, okay. So after I had my son, and after I'd stopped, breastfeeding, it was like a year after I was done breastfeeding and I still hadn't had a period. So I hadn't had a period in like 2.5 years or something like that. And I went to my doctor and I'm like, I am not getting a period. Like, this is really weird. He's like, oh, well then we'll put you on the pill. If you want to have a period. I'm like, no, I don't miss my period. Like that's not, it's like, I don't want to take something so that way I bleed for no reason. Like, I want to understand why. Anyway, that's my, everybody gets that story. So in order to answer that question, I need more information, right? Because I want to know whether or not these women are just like, because it could be that there's fertility being suppressed for a period of time. And then, it's after the period of suppression that their follicles start getting stimulated and then they have a regular cycle and then are bleeding in response to that. And the reason that's that people can experience a bleed, despite the fact that they're not ovulating, is that you still will generally get with some of these anovulatory cycles, the egg follicles do get stimulated to some degree. And as I noted, like, you can get this like increase in estrogen that happens, but nothing, you don't actually get true ovulation. But eventually those follicles that were being stimulated, they start to wither away and die. And that causes then estrogen levels to fall. And when you get plummeting levels of hormones, you bleed. And so that's like, it destabilizes the endometrial layer. And if there is an endometrial layer, and you'll get some cell proliferation that happens as a result of the stimulation of the egg follicles leading to estrogen, which causes proliferation of cells. And then when the estrogen levels fall, those cells that had started to divide, they fall out. It all falls down, just like Jack and Jill, right, going down the hill with a bucket of water. And so you do still get a bleed, even though there wasn't actual ovulation and the full differentiation of the endometrial layer, et cetera.
What about women who have had PCOS, for example? They're having anovulatory cycles. I know that was why I was just prescribed birth control as a teenager. I mean, you're getting when you're on birth control, you're getting a synthetic, right? If it's a combined one, a synthetic progestin. But you mentioned that some women are like the women who get bad PMS can often have postpartum depression and then often a harder time in perimenopause. I'm interested as well in PCOS because I know you talked last time about pill use, birth control can also contribute to things like major depressive disorder, which I mean, case in point on that. But also women who haven't been used to that progesterone and those calming brain effects and things. Do you think that they, maybe like me, after they've had loads of progesterone in pregnancy, when that falls now, they notice this big difference, right? And that contributes to mental health issues.
Exactly. I mean, it seems like the women who have the most difficult time with with postpartum and with perimenopause and just with a regular cycle, and the rise and fall of progesterone in the luteal phase. It's about sensitivity to the hormonal changes, right? And again, when we're talking about that sensitivity, it's like for some women, you can have these hormonal changes that happen in across the course of a cycle, or that happen, after the postpartum period. And they're again, and a lot of this has to do with cellular plasticity, right? Their cells are able to like quickly adjust, like, oh, okay, all right, here we go. Like, okay, there was all this progesterone before and now there isn't any. Like, we got to start sprouting out some more progesterone receptors because there's not a lot there and we got to bring it in. And so there's a lot of these kinds of little physiological changes that need to go on that make us less sensitive to hormonal changes. But I mean, it is like, if you know that you're somebody who's sensitive to hormonal changes because you had a rough postpartum, or you have a rough luteal phase, then I think it is really good to know so that we can bring in added support. So just to give an example with postpartum, one of the things that they're actually using as treatment for women with postpartum depression is this downstream product of progesterone metabolism called allopregnanolone. So one of the reasons that progesterone has this calming effect on the brain is because when it gets broken down in the body, it causes the release of a neurosteroid called allopregnanolone, which is very calming to the brain. That's the thing that's responsible for all that GABAergic activity, that calming activity. And so what researchers have found is that when you give women who are experiencing postpartum depression this drug that is essentially, it's allopregnanolone is what it is and you're able to taper that, they feel a whole lot better than they do when they're just allowed to fall off the cliff. Now, they could probably find the same effects from just giving women micronized progesterone that their bodies are able to then produce the allopregnanolone themselves. But I'm guessing that it's not patentable. And that's why they're using, going this other route and actually giving this drug that is, like allopregnanolone. But my guess is that you'd find the same effects with micronized progesterone. But the sort of takeaway here is that a big, wild hormonal swing, right? And you get that during perimenopause, you get that in the second half of the menstrual cycle, you get that postpartum, is a time that does create a window of vulnerability for women, right? When it's like, you might feel bad during this time because hormonal changes require a lot of sort of physiological dexterity, right? Just the ability to very quickly adapt. And if your cells are not able to do so for whatever reason, right? And some of those are things related to, lifestyle related factors that erode at that. But some women, it's just individual differences, unfortunately. Some of us, like, no matter, it's like there are some women that no matter what they do and how much they're treating their body as a temple, they still experience, these changes. And thankfully, there are other types of interventions that seem to be helpful, including, like I said, with this postpartum period, being able to give women micronized progesterone or giving them allopregnanolone. In perimenopause, of course, we know that the use of bioidentical hormonal treatments can be really palliative to a lot of women and make them feel better, including giving them micronized progesterone, even if they don't have a uterus. I just recently learned that women are only given progesterone generally as a course of their hormone therapy if they have a uterus, and if they don't, that they aren't, as if progesterone only acts in the uterus, which is cuckoo to me.
And they're not, and the other thing I find really interesting is they're not given it if they have a Mirena coil. So they're just given estrogen, which is that they're only getting localized progesterone or synthetic
Yeah, and it's not
progesterone
even
anyway.
progesterone,
No,
right?
it's
It's
not even
progestin.
progesterone, and it's localized, it's progestin. So then they're like, oh, we just give you estrogen. And I'm always saying when I'm coaching people, I'm like, why have you not asked for like progesterone or something like that to help you? It's really, I
It's
find
really
that really intriguing why they're.
Well, it's nuts. I mean, it's like, and even when you look in the research literature, when you see it in medical research and they're talking about progestins or progesterone, they talk about them interchangeably, right?
They're the same.
Yeah, like they're the same. And so it's like, it's really hard for anybody to find real answers on it, like on the differences. Like if you're somebody who's not really paying close attention, it's really easy to conflate the two and assume that they're the same thing when they're absolutely not. And I say that they're absolutely not in one of these like really nitpicky ways. Like sometimes people get, kind of nitpicky about like, well, the bleed you have when you're on the pill isn't really a period. And it's like, well, whatever, it's fine. It's like, it's bleeding, it's bleeding. It's not an endometrial layer, but whatever. The way it's experienced is the same. With progestins and progesterone, they're completely different. It's like, progestins are mostly made out of testosterone. And so when they get broken down in the body, they go on a totally different pathway than progesterone. And progesterone, when it gets broken down in the body, it releases a whole bunch of really cool compounds that are really good for the body, including allopregnanolone. And you don't get allopregnanolone release from a progestin. And allopregnanolone is like, it promotes neuroplasticity. It's anti-excitatory in the brain, so it's very calming. It's actually something that they're using for treatment in traumatic brain injury because that's like how good it is at minimizing excitotoxicity, like too much excitement in the brain. So it has all these really beautiful effects. And then doctors are being made to believe that it's like the same thing as a progestin when progestins don't do any of that great stuff.
Crazy.
And what is crazy. And then it's like, and then we wonder why, women are having, mental health related side effects or immunological, like autoimmune related side effects. Like progesterone is also like, it's immunomodulatory and it has these really nice anti-inflammatory effects on the body. And throughout history, the female immune system is more powerful and sort of inflammatory than the male immune system. In many ways. And one of the ways that our immune system has tapped the brakes on our incredibly explosive immune function is with progesterone release every month and during pregnancy, right? So our body has depended on the anti-inflammatory effects of progesterone being regularly exposed to that during cycles and during pregnancy. And then when we don't have that, and we have this incredibly powerful immune system, you're going to get autoimmunity. You're just going to, because our body is being, we're taking away something that historically has been present in women, during their childbearing years. And so because of this, we get these, runaway inflammatory responses that go on in women's bodies. And again, it's because we're not really appreciating the full range of effects that progesterone has on the female body. And the result of that is, it's like we give people birth control pills and we don't think like, oh, well, maybe we should also supplement with micronized progesterone, right? Giving them something that their body actually needs on top of the thing that they're taking to, whatever effect they're hoping for.
Yeah, I mean, when I look at my own case, it wasn't, it wasn't until I saw a specific hormone doctor that any of that was spoken about. I knew that I needed hormones, but I remember going to see my GP, and even with the background of major depressive disorder, I'd come off all psychiatric medication. Still, their first line was, well, you've had endometriosis and, it's going to be a relief to you, Angela, when you're finally post-menopause. So why don't we put you back on birth control? And I was like, no, I'm 47. Like, I don't want to be back on birth control. There's more going on, and that's not going to solve all these things.
It is so crazy to me how it's like our mental health is trivialized so much by medicine, where it's like, okay, well, we're going to take care of your endometriosis. I know there's these psychological side effects, but we're going to take care of the endometriosis. And like that's seen as a success or a victory. And it's like my mental health to me is at least as important as everything else that's going on in my body, and the idea that we're willing to just like, oh, well, you just like tolerate that, like whatever, like just suck it up, buttercup, we'll take care of the endometriosis. That's nuts to me. It's nuts to me. And you see that throughout medicine, Throughout medicine, mental health related side effects are always trivialized.
Yeah, they are. It's true. And yeah, and then you sort of wonder why women are then driven. Like, I mean, how often do we hear there were so many like memes and stuff, right, during COVID, like women just driven to go get a glass of wine, right? Because that releases GABA, exactly what they're looking for. And if you like post pregnancy, you've suddenly like, maybe you've just had another one and then you've got a toddler screaming in the bath. And there's so much around women just saying, I just need a glass of wine to get through bath time, or, I'm in perimenopause. And then they start to realize that the alcohol no longer is like working with them, and they're finding this out and trying, but they're not given any support. And it's no wonder that they drive towards it.
We're actually doing a research study right now looking at hormonal birth control and alcohol craving and use for that exact reason. It's like you suppress, progesterone when it's metabolized, you get that beautiful GABAergic effect, and that does go along the same pathways that alcohol stimulates. And when you're on the pill, you don't get it, because you're taking this progestin. So women who are on the pill, their levels of allopregnanolone are substantially lower than naturally cycling women's levels across the cycle. And so it would make sense that women might want to self-medicate from not having this activity going on in their brain with alcohol. And so what we're finding is that indeed, women who use hormonal birth control do have stronger alcohol cravings and report more alcohol use, even after you control for a whole bunch of different types of compounds. And so we're looking at whether or not we can actually minimize that by giving them micronized progesterone while they're taking the pill. And to see whether or not we can have some sort of a positive effect there. But I would assume the same, I would have no doubt in my mind that you get the same thing in perimenopause, because the first thing that happens is that progesterone falls. And so not having that, calming influence on your brain, it's really easy to turn to alcohol. And so there's every reason to expect that this would be a window of vulnerability for women. And, and yet, very few people are asking these questions. And I'm really thankful that, I've got the research team that I do, because we're starting to look at some of these questions and hopefully be able to provide some relief to women, both who are on hormonal birth control and then eventually also looking at women in the perimenopausal transition.
That's really interesting. I can't wait to hear more on that. When you look at women then who are in perimenopause and then postmenopause, so they've got this progesterone deficiency now because they're not ovulating, right? And yet a lot of women aren't taking medication or hormones. Some are. When progesterone is prescribed, it's often prescribed to take at night so that it improves sleep. But obviously, that's very different when you're taking it then to how your hormones would naturally be pulsing it, right? In terms of for women listening to this who may be using, so because I've also heard oral progesterone. I mean, it's interesting you're studying it in relation to alcohol use and birth control. I've heard like doctors like Dr. Louise Newson, for example, using it now in younger women to help with things like PMS and PMDD, is giving them progesterone. Is there a perfect time for people who are taking progesterone to take it?
I have only seen it used at night. So, that's how that's the research that I'm familiar with. And we have not, when we've been considering with our own research, we were just going to go with the usual take it at night, just because for a lot of women, it does make them sleepy. But I don't know. And I haven't really, to be honest with you, I haven't really spent a whole lot of time thinking about different types of dosing regimens. But of course, anytime that you take something once a day, as you get this big bolus of this, whatever it is, this medication, and then like kind of peters out throughout the day, it's going to have a different effect than what would be going on naturally if it was being released in pulsate form like it normally is in the body.
Yeah, it'd be a bit different. What about acne? So this is another thing that's common in cycling women in the luteal phase, and then also in perimenopausal women.
Yeah, so acne is usually the result of testosterone and androgens going cuckoo crazy. And generally, what you tend to see with women and this also is true with the luteal phase to a lesser extent, but certainly in the case of perimenopause, you get these wild swings of testosterone where you'll get like surges and then declines. And the result of that is when you're having these surges is that it does increase the probability of acne, because you get more production of like sebum and some other things that can get clogged up in your pores and kind of give you a hard time. And, the good news is, I guess, if there is any good news to be had, is that there's a lot of ways that you can manage this that, don't require you to go on hormonal birth control or, do some of these other things, including things like red light therapy and blue light therapy. They're actually found to be really effective in terms of helping to promote, healthy skin cells and minimize overproduction of oils. And I for one use a red light and I also use blue light therapy when I'm getting little breakouts, and to tremendous success. It's
They
been
are
really
amazing, I have to
useful.
say,
Yeah.
yeah. I think they are.
Yeah, no, yeah, and I've got a teenager who suffers from acne, and he's had really great success with that as well.
And obviously in teenage boys, that would you say for teenage girls it's the same? Is it the changes in testosterone that's giving them the acne?
Yeah, it's almost always testosterone. It's kind of the bad guy when it comes to skin, because it is inflammatory and it does increase sebum production. And when you get overproduction there, and your cells aren't able to turn over, and keeping up with everything, it can create buildup and problems with acne.
What about heavy bleeding? This is back
Hmm.
to progesterone. This is super
Yeah.
common.
Heavy bleeding is generally, you get heavier bleeding when you have lower levels of progesterone. And progesterone helps to thin out the endometrial lining. And the result of that is that you tend to get a little bit of a lighter bleed. And so, one of the things that many women notice when they're going through perimenopause is that they get these really outrageous periods, right? Like the red tide. It's just, it's a really miserable experience. I've got a lot of friends who've tell me about their period related issues. And that's a very common theme. And that again is something where if you're taking, if you're using hormone therapy and you take micronized progesterone, you can also thin out your endometrial layer, which makes it a little bit of a less gnarly period.
What about for teenage girls? Like how much, if you have a mum listening to this, how much of this is normal in young girls? Why would they be having heavy bleeding?
Yeah. So young girls, I mean, and here's the thing, and as a mother of a teenager, I'll tell you that this is one of those things where it's like, it's easier for me to communicate this to you than it is going to be for you to effectively communicate it to your daughter and have her feel okay about it. Because it's not fun. And the fact is, like, especially when we're young women, the relationship between our brain, our pituitary, and our ovaries is still maturing, right? And so our brain is learning to pick up on our sex hormones and learning to understand what everything means, right? And as a result, and our ovaries are learning to listen to our brain, and it's a learning curve, right? And the result of that is that many women, especially for the first couple of years that they're cycling, their cycles can be inconsistent, right? So like they don't always have them, or they have them and they're longer than what they're supposed to be, or they're shorter than they're supposed to be, or they've got two in a month, and all these crazy things can happen. But it's really just part of that. You can almost think of it as like brain ovary education, right? It's almost like camp, right? And so just really understand that it's temporary. And that it's not easy, right? Because sometimes we're going to produce way too much estrogen, right? Or not enough progesterone. And the result is that sometimes we're going to have these really gnarly periods and they're going to be awful. And then sometimes we're going to have really light periods and not know what's going on. It really shouldn't last more than a couple of years. And I know a couple of years, like when you're a teenager, that sounds like a lifetime, right? But if you're able to be patient, it really does get better, and this is a time when I really do not recommend hormonal birth control for women unless they absolutely need it because they're sexually active and they're not going to, nothing else works for them. I think that's, obviously everybody can make their own decisions, but, your brain and ovaries are learning to communicate during this time. And allowing that to happen means that your cycle is going to be a whole lot easier, more predictable, right? And I mean, and just better manageable, if you just give it that little bit of time to allow that communication pathway to develop, because it does take a little bit of time and it really can be very frustrating. And, thankfully we live in a time where we have period underwear, which thank God for period underwear. Like I wish I had those when I was in middle school
Yeah,
and
I mean, they
cycling.
didn't exist when, yeah, I was at school.
So it's like if you had a leak, you were just, everybody knew, and so now we have period underwear that you can use as extra protection during times that you're cycling. And I know it's not fun, but it really is temporary. and your brain and your ovaries are going to learn to talk to each other in a way that makes sense, and that turbulence can decrease dramatically.
Okay, so so for people to understand, then to put people into sort of, I don't like to bucket people, but if you've got a teenage daughter, this communication pathway is developing, and actually you're better waiting, as hard as that is, 2-3 years, she's going to have better communication and her periods will normalize. So not jumping in with birth control unless there is a contraceptive driver that they can't get around. But then when we look at, from everything you've been saying up until now, when we look at women who are in their 20s and 30s who should still have good fertility, if they're having really heavy bleeds, could be stress, inflammation, investigating endometriosis, the things we've been speaking about. And then unfortunately, perimenopause is like a second teenage, right? Where we're going to have it. Some of us.
Yeah. And I mean, certainly, if you're in your, 20s and you're having issues with your cycle, like if you've been cycling for more than 3 years, 2 or 3 years, and you're having, ridiculous cramps or, really heavy cycles, certainly go and see a doctor and get investigated for things like fibroids, for things like endometriosis, getting your hormones measured, looking for a pituitary tumor, which can, lead to, funky cycles, and these pituitary tumors sound scarier than they are. They're usually benign and they can resolve themselves on their own a lot of times, but sometimes they don't. And so it's just a matter of trying to get at the heart of what's going on, so that way you don't have to rely on birth control as you're feeling like you have your back up against a wall. Because unfortunately, that's what, and I'm sure you had this experience with your doctor, where it does feel like your back is up against a wall. And it's like, that's the only thing that you're offered, right? Is like, oh, well, here's a pill or you're going to suffer. It's like, well, great, like great. So, that investigating, so that way, you can figure out what some of your other options are instead of just feeling like you have to rely on birth control if you don't want to be on it.
I want to take a quick break from this episode to thank our sponsors. Just a quick pause to tell you about something I've been experimenting with over the last few months. It's called Quantum Upgrade by Leela Q. Now, I'll admit that streaming quantum energy to your body might sound a bit out there, and I'm naturally skeptical when it comes to things like this. But this concept is actually backed by real data. Leela Q has run over 20 studies, including a randomized placebo-controlled trial exploring how quantum upgrade affects the body during 5G exposure. And in the study, participants were exposed to a 5G-enabled phone for 30 minutes without the quantum upgrade. Stress-related brain activity, specifically beta and gamma waves, increased and HRV dropped. But with quantum upgrade active, the opposite happened. Beta activity linked to stress in the temporal lobe dropped by 82%. Gamma activity linked to stress in the limbic system dropped by 77%. And alpha waves associated with calm and clarity increased more than 13-fold. And HRV markers significantly improved, returning to baseline. That's a huge shift in the body's stress response, and a big reason I've been trying it. So what is quantum upgrade? It's a streamed energetic field delivered directly to your body or location. You can tailor it depending on your needs. And the best part is that you can try it completely free with no credit card required and feel the difference for yourself. Just head over to quantumupgrade.io and use code Angela15 for a 15-day free trial. That's quantumupgrade.io and code Angela15 for your 15-day free trial. And I'll also put a link and the code in the show notes below. Yeah, 100%. And I think I'll point people back to the earlier episode we did on birth control to really inform themselves, because that pathway that you're talking about, that communication, I think is really, really important. And for many young girls like me, right, it was never allowed to develop because you would just prescribe birth control, and it led and can lead to, from your research, problems later, right, with mental health. So I think it's a really important point. And then just finally, women in general in the research, you talk about bikini science, bikini medicine. We're not seeing enough women. Why is this? We are beginning now. It's beginning to get more of a voice. You obviously you're doing a lot of research in this area. What changes can we see coming up? What do you think should be happening as well?
So in my book, and in the last chapter of the book in particular, I spend some time talking about the fact that I think that science needs a do-over. And, the way that women have been handled in science and medicine is, of course, first, our needs were completely ignored, right? Because nobody really cared about how women, experience everything. And then the assumption was just that women are just like small men, but with breasts and ovaries, right? And this is how we were handled in medicine. And this is also how we were handled in science. And so, even though women now are included in research, once researchers had to start including women in research, they were still operating under the assumption that women are just like small men with breasts and ovaries. And so women are currently the gold standard in most biomedical research is to only include women as subjects and participants in research during the first 7 to 9 days of their menstrual cycle. So they only study women at times when hormone levels are low and women are maximally like men. And they do this to try to decrease the amount of variability that they get in their research findings, right? And so if you study a group of people and some of them are men and some of them are women in the early phases of the cycle, you can just include them in one study. You don't even test for sex differentiation. And then you say, oh, and here are the results. And this is the gold standard for research. And what this means is that researchers aren't testing for sex differentiation of almost anything, right? So when you look at even things like, there was a recent review that was done looking at in neuroscience and neuropsychology, which are areas where we know that there's sex differentiation, right? Like women get diagnosed with depression and anxiety at twice the rate of men, right? Whereas men have issues like, for example, autism, right, at like 4 times the rate of women, right? And so we know there's sex differences here, but the way that research is done, they almost never test for it, right? They'll just test for people, right? Don't include enough each men and women to be able to test for sex differentiation, and then only studying women when their hormone levels are low. So that way they don't have to deal with our sex hormones. And all of this is doing a huge disservice to understanding women. Right. I call for like this scientific do-over. The first part of the scientific do-over is that we need to include enough both men and women in each research study to be able to test for sex differentiation in case it exists. Because the fact of the matter is, even though, there aren't a lot of, there aren't like there are some super obvious sex differences, like obviously breasts and ovaries are big ones, but there's sex differentiation all over the place, right? There are sex differences in our cardiovascular systems. There are sex differences in our immune systems. There are sex differences in our metabolism. Female and male bodies are very different from one another from head to toe in almost anything that you could possibly study. And we need to stop assuming that they're always going to be the same, right? And they might be the same in some ways, but researchers should have the onus of having to prove that they're different or prove that they're the same, right? So start with the assumption that male bodies and female bodies might respond to things differently. And if they're going to just simply lump men and women together in research, they have to first show that there's no sex differentiation on whatever it is that they want to measure. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that we need to study women as women. And this means actually studying women and how they're responding to any type of a medication or any type of a treatment in both major phases of the menstrual cycle. So we need to study how women are responding to things when estrogen is the primary hormone. And we need to look at how women are responding to things when progesterone is the prominent hormone or the primary hormone. Because the fact is that our hormonal changes impact the way that we respond to things. Right. And there's a reason that, many women, for example, like it's more than like 80% of women who have asthma experience premenstrual worsening of their symptoms. So their symptoms are worse in the luteal phase compared to other phases of the cycle. And it's because their medication isn't managing their symptoms as well at that time. But nobody ever thought to measure that. It's like, oh, well, hormones, whatever. It's just noise. But it's like, on the one hand, the researchers say, oh, it's just noise. But on the other hand, they know that they affect things, or else they wouldn't feel so, certain that they should only be studying women at these points when hormone levels are low. And they want to study women when hormone levels are low because they know hormones matter and they know that they have the ability to impact any outcome that they might measure. And they need to study that instead of control for it. Because the fact is, the way that science is currently being conducted, it actually doesn't serve the needs of women at all. And it never will unless we make these changes. So we need to understand that there might be sex differentiation in anything that we're measuring, and we should have to test for it. And then when we include women in research, we need to be studying them as women, which means accounting for instead of controlling for their hormonal variation in response to different types of interventions. So that's the change.
Service to women.
Yeah,
Massive.
I know.
I mean, yeah.
I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Crazy.
And honestly, it's like, after that, of course, we also then need to do a better job of studying women in pregnancy and in menopause. And, it's like we are a moving target. And yes, that's inconvenient for science, right? Like, oh no, we have to study women in these different types of states because women experience these different types of states. It's like we have to understand these things. And we can't just say that, oh, well, this drug that, manages symptoms well when hormone levels are low is going to, is going to work when women are pregnant or when they're in the luteal phase of the cycle. It might not, and we need to know that. We deserve to know that. And it's like, it's going to mean that science is going to be a little bit harder to do and it's going to take longer, but it's going to mean that we actually get to serve the needs of the other 50% of the population that has been completely ignored and had their needs, glossed over since the dawn of medicine. And it's time to make those changes.
It is such a powerful thing to say. So important. Such a powerful thing to close on. I mean, if their asthma was getting worse at a certain time, this would be studied, right? This is just, I can't believe that we just overlook these things. And in fact, what you're saying actually is a little bit more insidious than that. In fact, we purposefully design studies knowing that it makes a difference so that we don't have to study it in that way, which.
Exactly. No, and that's exactly it. And nobody has batted an eyelash at this. This is the way that science has been done since women have started to be included in research, and it doesn't work. It's time for it to stop.
And do we have, just kind of finally, do we have an opinion now in terms of how catabolic, for example, the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle is? Because I know when I've seen other experts now talking about it, they're saying, oh, actually, when we looked at this, it was more kind of molecular or mechanistic, and we're not sure, and maybe women can get the same muscle growth throughout the menstrual cycle. And so it feels like it's all just been, all the balls have gone back in the air, and maybe there aren't any sex differences in that, where there are sex differences, obviously, between men and women, but maybe we don't need to change training. Where do you come out on that now? Because that all seems to have been thrown up in the air again.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it seems like, I think that this is just another one of these things where it's like, we need more data and the data will tell us what the story is. There's evidence that finds that, that you can give women the exact same, exercise routine. And if you have them heavy loading the lifting in the luteal phase or having them heavy loading their lifting in the follicular phase, that you get differences in how much muscle mass you build. And the women who were doing the heavy loading in the follicular phase built more lean muscle mass than the women who are doing the same exercise routine in the luteal phase. So there's some of that research. There's some other research that finds that there's, doesn't seem to be real cycle-based differences. And so my guess is that this is going to be just another one of these things where there's not like a one size fits all sort of relationship that women have with their hormones. And that for some women, you get these really pronounced effects. And that for other women, they're sort of more mitigated. But I'll say this, like when you look at a lot of the research that's been done in the area where they're like, oh, look, our hormones really don't matter, is that a lot of these studies aren't using a very particularly sophisticated way of measuring hormonal change. And we don't know, for example, for certain whether or not these women are ovulating or not ovulating. And as we noted, about 30% of the time when we bring in women in the lab and it looks like they're ovulating, unless we're actually taking their hormone measures. And then it's like, oh no, actually this is a failure to ovulate cycle. In those types of cycles, it can look like there's no cycle-based differences. And it's because there's not a lot of hormonal differences because the women aren't ovulating. And so there's also just like a lot of messiness within the literature where you have a whole range of effects that are going on, right? Where it's like, does this work or does this not work? And which is why I always urge women, I'm like, you need to track for yourself. You got to track this on your own because the fact is, even if there is a consensus about like for most women, this, you might be one of the women for whom that's not true. And just to give an example of this, like right near ovulation, when estrogen is high and rising in the cycle, that's a time that most women feel really good. Like they tend to have a lot of energy and they feel sexy and all of these other things. And there's about 10% of the population that feels their absolute worst across the cycle when estrogen is high. And so there's a lot of idiosyncrasy in the way that our bodies respond to hormonal changes. And so like one of the things that we can really do to our own benefit is start to understand our body's relationship with hormonal change, which is why, I make the recommendation to women that they track their cycles. And I've got free resources for doing this on my website. And of course, you can also use, an Oura ring or whatever else you want to actually track where you are in your cycle, but then also keeping a diary. So that way you can start to make note of changes in things like physical strength and endurance and appetite and sexual desire, and whether you're having side effects from your medication or whether your chronic condition is being well maintained by your existing medication. Tracking these things in conjunction with tracking your cycle, I think, can be really useful to women to start to understand their own personal relationship with hormonal changes in their body. So that way they can sort of set up their lives in a way that allows them to thrive and sort of maximize where they are.
So, so important. I love that just bio-individuality, right? Because everyone, I know, like I used to feel great on the first day of my period and be able to lift really heavy. Other women just don't feel good. And I think that, again, is just so individual, isn't it? You need.
I'm the same way. Like I changed my site. I changed my workouts over the last couple of years to emphasize the strength training in the first 2 weeks of my cycle. And for me, it makes a big difference because I was able to get stronger by taking like about 12 days off of heavy lifting, and I feel better, and I don't have the relationship that I would have with myself when I was forcing myself to lift in the throes of the luteal phase, when I just felt tired and weak. And it felt like, I was working against myself. And so sort of removing that from my own life has been really helpful. But I mean, like you said, the data are a little bit everywhere. And so there's a lot of contradictory messages out there. And so my recommendation to everyone is find out for yourself. It's a pretty low cost thing to do, where it's not going to totally throw you off your, game if you try something that doesn't work for you. But like I found for myself, and with some of the research that we've done looking at this, I'm looking at women's own reports of their strength and how they're feeling. It seems to work for some women, even if it doesn't work for everyone.
Anything else that we haven't covered that you like to point towards? Obviously, I want to refer people to the book because the book's coming out very soon. It's incredible. But is there anything that we haven't covered on this interview that you think is really important when you were writing it?
For me, I think like one of the most important things is just understanding that your body is like this really marvelous machine. And it goes from being in a state that is optimized for attraction and sex during the first 14 days of the cycle. And then it has to totally reinvent itself into this completely different version of itself that is a safe and happy place for implantation and pregnancy. And the result of this is it's a complete transformation in a lot of ways, internally and psychologically. And so, one of the things I do in the book is I just really like outline like what is it their body is actually doing during this time, and then how can this create some of the experiences that some of us experience. And I think that really starting to understand and appreciate what your body is trying to do is really the first step in developing a relationship where women can learn to trust their body, to listen to what it's telling them, right? And then be able to create less of an adversarial relationship with themselves. I think that a lot of women, have been raised in a cultural paradigm where it's really easy for us to believe that our body is the enemy. And I think that when we learn to actually understand what our body is trying to do and start giving it what it needs and working with it instead of against it, I think that it can fundamentally change the nature of that relationship.
I love that. I think we hate on it too much. It's just, yeah, and it does wonderful things. I think so. I mean, you can share where people can find you, your work. Period Brain is coming out. It's just such an amazing, amazing book. I wish I had this when I was younger. Certainly for me, having a daughter, I think anyone listening to this, right? If you're a woman who's in her cycling years, if you're making that transition through perimenopause, if you're a mum like me, I just think you just need to get a copy of this book and go buy it for your friends and share it with them. And the other one actually about birth control, because I just think that's a whole piece that needs to be added into this. So I want to thank you for your work, Sarah. Just pretty amazing, everything you're doing. How can people connect with you? Where can they find you? Where can they buy the book?
You can find the book anywhere that books are sold. Amazon, Barnes and Noble, your local indie retailer should have access. It'll be everywhere. And you can connect with me on social media. I'm most active on Instagram, but I'm on all different platforms. And my handle is Sarah E. Hill, PhD, and that's Sarah with an H. And you can also find me online at my website and find resources there. And that's sarahehill.com.
Amazing. Thank you so much. We will link to all of that in the show notes. It's been super fun chatting to you again. And I can't wait to hear just more of the research and everything you're doing, keeping up with it.
Thank you so much for having me back. It's always so much fun chatting with you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.